Hi, everyone. Welcome to our next video podcast with myself hosting and, of course, head of editorial, Tristan de Souza. Tristan, how are you doing?
I'm good, Ian. Thank you very much. We're opening up slowly but surely here in the UK, aren't we? So, I mean, there's excitement in the air. Spring was in the air and then it snowed again. So it's hard to know whether we're coming or going, but we're certainly good to go on here on the podcast front.
And I have to say, in the interest of an amazing segue, opening up is really how we describe our first topic, yeah?
Yeah.
So as you know, there was this ship, and this ship got stuck. And this ship got stuck in a particularly difficult, sensitive, and constrained place in the world, i.e. the Suez Canal. 7 days or so went by. The global supply chain was kind of brought to a standstill. Well, I mean, what are your thoughts on the level of vulnerability that this one choke point, which has always been a choke point ever since the Suez Canal was built? What are your thoughts?
Well, I was fascinated by this from the outset, just simply because it caught everyone's imagination, didn't it? Giant ship gets, I guess, blown off course, or not off course, because it's very hard to be off course in a canal, right? But, you know, like just ends up pointing in the wrong direction in a canal. And it's sort of, you know, seeing those pictures of ships backed up all the way in both directions on either side of the continent of Africa is quite a striking thing. And as you say, a very visual representation of the global supply chain that we all benefit quite strongly from. I think in terms of what it showed about the weakness of that, as you say, it's always been a choke point. I guess maybe as shipping has the size of ships has increased, the likelihood of that happening may well have increased. I don't know that for a fact, but you know, the isolation of that particular point at which the ship got wedged was also of note. You know, I mean, it was hundreds of miles away from the nearest digger, and when the diggers got there, you know, those pictures of the tiny little digger and the Ever Given's nose, apart from spawning a load of really good memes, you know, were also, I think, indicative, like a visual representation of the global supply chain. If something goes wrong, we are puny in the face of the sort of organizational challenges. And if things need to then go around the Horn of Africa, I mean, the increased cost and time really starts putting a strain on an already strained global economy.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me because there's so many good cybersecurity, cyber metaphors on this particular thing. And it was, I think the thing that I found most interesting is, was there a plan? Like, clearly the fact that the digger shows up, completely inadequate for the task at hand. To deal with it. The other problem with the canal being blocked is getting the necessary resources down to that point, like you said, either overland in a hostile desert or, you know, directly sailing down the blocked canal, trying to get around all of the other things blocked in the canal.
Yeah.
You know, it's difficult to reverse out of a canal, you know, several hundred, you know, miles. So the real question is, you know, and the big takeaway for me was, what is the plan for when these type of things go sideways, right? You know, and we saw, you know, dredging, and then finally, you know, an international response, really. And in order to get it unstuck and get global trade moving again. I find it really interesting that we're so precarious, like you said, that these events can happen, and we are the proverbial little digger machine trying to undig a giant ship, you know, that almost has its own postcode. It's so big.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was big, wasn't it? So did you see that diagram which showed that it was it had the Eiffel Tower, the Empire State Building, and then the Ever Given. And then obviously like the Burj Al Khalifa, which is like a kilometer tall. But I mean, it's like taller than the Empire State Building. So yeah, a wonderful physical representation of trade. But what I was reading earlier today about Samsung's moves in diversifying its supply chain away from where it had previously been concentrated, specifically and almost exclusively in China. So its chips and phones and everything was constructed at various points in China, but nonetheless in China. And over the last year, two, or maybe slightly more, they've moved factories from China to Vietnam and at various other points around the world in order specifically to combat something like either the Ever Given blocking the Suez Canal or a global pandemic in which goods can't cross borders. And as a direct result of that, they've actually managed to maintain their essentially making a profit from the products that they've been producing because of this diversification. And, you know, in the face of the pandemic, we've seen sort of calls for renationalization of businesses, or rather sort of bringing back on shore, re-onshoring of businesses, right? So that you know, this new vaccine that we're going to be producing at all places, Barnard Castle, you know, which Boris Johnson somehow managed not to say on live TV, which is quite incredible. But you know, there is something of this. Maybe this will be yet another push to governments who want to bring stuff back within their own borders.
I think that's an important consideration, and certainly the Chinese and Japanese are long-term thinkers. I would add to that diversification and resiliency play against global climate change and planet warming and all of the perils that come along with that.
Yeah.
So speaking of perils, if you're a senior executive of a White House government department, such as, I'm just going to pull one out of the air here, the Department of Homeland Security.
Oh, I wonder why you did that, Ian. Please tell me.
And you may have had Russians in your inbox.
Yeah.
The prospects of that are particularly chilling, are they not?
Yeah, I mean, but espionage seems to have been stepped up over the last few years, right? I mean, 2016, we saw election meddling. 2020, we also saw election meddling. And 2021, we appear to have seen massive governmental compromise on a scale that, you know, we haven't seen before, and or at least of the US. And if you are one of these departmental heads, you're going to be baying for blood. But I'm not entirely sure where that blood is going to come from, because, you know, for all his faults, and they were many, Donald Trump did actually put quite a lot of Russians under sanctions. So, I mean, I don't know whether you can sanction Russia even more, or rather, sanction. Well, they're fighting on two fronts, right? I mean, you're sort of looking at the Russians and Chinese, but you know, sanctions. We were talking about this last month. You know, sanctions are one way of dealing with it, but sort of a cyberkinetic response is also another way. But I don't really see that Joe Biden has a lot of leeway either way. I don't know where you see the action going from here.
Well, it's really interesting to me. There's been some threats made, and, you know, at the end of the day, how much victim blaming are you going to put on the shoulders of SolarWinds and Microsoft in terms of, you know, the compromise itself? But I am seeing, you know, we have two particular problems that I think are coming to apparent. We have no recourse or way of dealing with this that is anything less than an impotent response. And I think the other part of this is that response is extremely difficult when you're as vulnerable as the American government has now proven itself to be, despite the billions of dollars that they have invested in cybersecurity. When your director of one of the most important agencies that the United States relies on for homeland protection, when that information is compromised, the ramifications of that can be extreme. And I mean, knocking back, counterterrorism investigations, espionage investigations, all of those, could have potentially been compromised to a certain extent. Now, the current narrative that we're hearing is that no secure, sensitive systems were compromised. And that seems to be the party line. I wonder about that, because here's the reality. Those systems are incredibly complex. They're also difficult to use from a user perspective. How many times in the civilian world have people sent an important document to their personal email because they're having problems with their work system and they need to get things done? I'm not saying you should do that, and I'm not saying by any means that that's acceptable content, but it happens.
For sure.
And people make mistakes, right? People attach sensitive information and then send it to the wrong people. That type of information happens. So the idea that somehow we remain a lot safer because the secret, and classified systems were uncompromised, I think is a distraction campaign from the reality of you're either compromised or you're not. You're either pregnant or you're not, right? And the idea of, kind of being able to introduce nuance into it, similar to some of the statements I've heard from companies that have suffered a horrific data breach. And they're saying, well, our plan for improvement is not an admission that we had problems to begin with. It's an opportunity for improvement. I feel, is the needle somewhere in between?
Yeah, well, I mean, is it the case necessarily that you're either compromised or you're not? I mean, in this case, yes, it's a fairly black and white deal, but could it not be said that there are gradations of espionage? As there are gradations of sort of importance of information. Classified and then sort of semi-classified. And I mean, you'll know better than me. You have a military background. I certainly do not. There are gradations of classification of information, right? So surely there's a defense to be made, or perhaps there's a defense to be made in terms of okay, they got a bunch of email addresses, but they didn't get blueprints for the next missile that we're going to be, constructing. Is that not a line that could be taken?
It's such a difficult line because the counter argument is if I take 10,000 unclassified documents from you, but I take one secret document from you, how much harm has actually been done, right?
Yeah.
It's so difficult to put a proportionality around it. And I think, this is where I'm going with this, is that we are at a critical juncture where we see this clear chain of events that happened. And, as the government, are you really going to turn around and crush the, major industry with punitive treatment? Now, it was fine to treat, Huawei and Kaspersky, with punitive treatment because they weren't American companies.
They're not American companies.
But are you going to really take, Microsoft and, Amazon and all of the others to task over this when clearly this was, the vehicle that, and this is sort of one of the problems that we're having conflating cyberspace to physical space, right?
Yeah.
If I lend you my car in good faith, Tristan, and you then go and rob a bank with my car, okay? I'm not responsible for what you did when I lent you my car.
No.
Because I acted in good faith, right?
Mm-hmm.
So why is it different for cyber? I think that's one of the problems here that is going on, is that, if I use your product in a way that it wasn't designed for, or I don't follow the best practices of implementation, is it truly my fault that you got hacked? So there is this gray area that I think is going to be very difficult, and I feel that we're at a time where we need to have these conversations, and there needs to be some regulation, because when you have three of the most powerful, software companies in the world stand up and say, yeah, there's no real compelling reason at the federal level that we have to report data breach, that's a concern.
Yeah, that is a concern. 100%, I would agree. But I mean, I think, perhaps one of the reasons that there is such a conflation of the physical and the cyber is because of the bleeding between the two, right? And so it's actually very hard for those in power, those legislating, many of whom, let's face it, are of an older generation. And I think that actually also has to be taken into account. When we saw Zuckerberg go up in front of, Senate committees, they were all, apart from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, like 60 plus. And there's some of the questions they were asking were just devoid of reason. They were not helpful. They did not move the topic on. And I think actually this may be slightly symptomatic of that as much as anything else, that they are seeing this very much in sort of, for want of a more technical term, olden days way of looking at it, right? They're not seeing the bigger cyber picture. And as a direct result of that, we perhaps are not getting the legislation that we need.
And that is actually a great way, because this episode seems to be the episode of segues.
Boom, boom, boom. I love
talking about the American problem.
Yeah.
And I see the American problem in three different silos. First of all, arguably one of the most advanced and, shall we say, prosperous digital economies, right? However, it also appears that a ton of cybercrime of Americans on Americans, or Americans against the world, also happening in America, if you look at the IC3 data that the FBI publishes annually.
Yeah.
And finally, as we unearthed with some of our research, the problem of American infrastructure providers providing the means and the enablement to conduct cybercrime, both on American people as well as the world at large. How does Joe Biden or the government of the United States fix what seems to be a problem that, if you fix one issue, it directly impacts the livelihoods of the entire digital economy that the United States is so based on?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I have a feeling you might have quite a few answers to this. So I might turn it round at you and say, given what we've said in previous podcasts this year about Biden's plans, he clearly has a plan. He clearly is going to act. He's clearly engaged with the problem. He's been around government for a long time. When he was in the Obama administration, he was pretty switched in. His chief of Homeland Security, national security chief, I think Jake Sullivan, is a young fella, he's 40s max. Biden seems to have put together a team that can deal with these problems. But my question to you is, given all of those problems that you outlined, Americans on Americans, foreign actions on American soil which can't be investigated by the American government, is it going to be enough for just the American government to do it? Is it really just the responsibility of Biden? Or does there have to be a supranational response to these sorts of threats?
Yeah, it's such an interesting situation, but I feel like we're sort of at this situation where the problem is getting getting anti-business. I think cybercrime is starting to take too big a chunk out of it. And the real question comes down to, when you look at it at the internet service providers level and the infrastructure provider levels, it seems to me that we do and have more scrutiny of the companies that are and their customers, and more visibility of that. And I think that one of the problems is, again, and this is always the juxtaposition of trading convenience for security. I've noticed now some providers, SendMail being a good example, have a lot more scrutiny around who's subscribing to and using their services. When I did some Bitcoin purchasing from the exchange, they took as much personal information about me and made me fill out questionnaires and made me upload identity documents in order to conduct that transaction. The question is, if I want to rent servers and get certificates and register domains, suspiciously like large commercial domains, why isn't that due diligence being done? And I think it's because these providers are not held accountable for the actions on their platforms, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
In the banking industry, and the banking industry is by no means perfect, but in the banking industry, your organization, say Deutsche Bank, if criminal activity is going through your bank, you have skin in the game. You can't
100%.
simply sit back and go, oh, we had no idea that these criminals were laundering money through our organization. I think we're going to see some pretty aggressive know thy customer legislation coming into this whole cyber infrastructure situation. I think that'll help. But I think...
Okay, but then do we see cyber tax havens as a direct result of that, right? Do we surely not then move to a world... You used the analogy of finance, and I think that is the perfect one, because if you're having know thy customer regulation on US soil, maybe there will be offshore US islands that you can nonetheless operate from as if you were a US company, using those same structures that people avoid tax with, through the British Virgin Islands or whatever, in order to continue your nefarious operations without being able to be looked at by the American government.
Absolutely. I mean, we're going to have space hosting. Right, yeah. we're going to have hosting providers located in international waters.
Right.
I mean, yes, because for every change, that we do to support, lawful trade and law enforcement, there are going to be folks that use those amazing minds they have, the cyber Lex Luthors, if you will, to do cybercrime, right? Because that's what they do. And there are bulletproof hosting todays and dark web sites and all of that kind of stuff. And I think, again, perfect opportunity to talk about the big problem in Big China. Yeah. Because in order to have this stuff work, you have to have international consensus and you have to have an equal playing field. And I feel right now that our Western morality and civility and rules in terms of how we conduct business and how we're supposed to conduct business and how we're regulated to conduct business is putting us at a huge disadvantage against countries like China who seem to have complete disregard for a westernized set of values and cultural approach.
Yeah, I mean, how do you mean a disadvantage? So you're saying because we're playing by the rules, we're sort of slightly screwing ourselves over?
Well, so I'll give you a great example, right? We have a very distasteful regime in Africa.
Okay.
Western nations are prohibited by law from dealing with that country because it is sanctioned, because we know they are using those weapons to probably, most likely, kill some sort of indigenous potential, democracy.
A minority population somewhere, yeah.
The Chinese have no compunction about selling, despite the fact that a ton of nations at the UN level have said, oh, by the way, these are bad people doing bad things to their own people. The Chinese are be like, we'll sell to them anyways. And they're doing this in cyber as well, right? Yeah. We saw, back in, I think it was around 2010, even 2014, a keynote from General Alexander about the biggest transfer of intellectual property and wealth going on from the United States to China. Mm. The same regime that has now been globally accused of genocide, right? Yeah. Has been suppressing a democratic movement in Hong Kong, and essentially is holding 2 Canadians hostages as a result of the ongoing fisticuff over the extradition of the CFO of Huawei in Canadian jail, awaiting transfer to the United States. And what has our response been? Tepid at best.
Okay, but what? Yes, sorry to first of all agree with you. It has been tepid, but the way in which we go about engaging. Okay, what do we want? Are we going to march in there and topple the regime? Are we going to rerun the Are we going to rerun the opium wars? We can't do that because they've got a bigger army than us anyway. Okay, it was cyber retaliation. The US has said, they're rolling in place a plan that they're going to hit Russia where the Russian administration knows, but it won't necessarily be obvious to the public, just to demonstrate, where some cyber red lines are. That's an interesting response. I don't really see it deterring Russia very much from carrying on its pretty nefarious dealings with most Western democracies. And, if we were to do that with China, the risk is that they left a ton of backdoors in all of the Microsoft Exchange servers that that numerous Chinese groups eventually piled in on when Microsoft released the out-of-bound patch earlier this year. So then it's kind of like is this a mutually assured cyber destruction? Whereby there has to be a standoff because any action from one side will precipitate detrimentally destructive action from the other, and thus meltdown all over the world. I think there is an argument for that, but I find that less compelling because of the way in which both world diplomacy and the global economy have moved on since the initial introduction of mutually assured destruction as a concept in the first nuclear era. Stupidly, the British government has recently said we're going to ramp up our nuclear capability, and it's we don't even need to go into that here. It's the most ridiculous step that a Western nation has made for a very long time. It sends all the wrong signals. What are we going to do if they hack our critical national infrastructure? We're going to chuck several nukes at them.
Seems a little bit disproportionate.
Well, no, I mean the argument from the upper echelons might be, well, they've destroyed our society in a certain way by bringing down our entire power grid, so we're going to destroy their society. Anyway, it's stupid. It doesn't make sense. But the changes since nuclear weapons were a mutually assuring had that capability. Like, China needs us. It has an awful lot of customers in Africa who I think could not necessarily be said to be as engaged in the global supply chain as intricately as Europe, China, and the Americas. If China was to go about bringing down the power grid in, say, Germany, as Russia did in the Ukraine, that I think would have a far different and more negative impact on China itself. So I don't really see the mutually assured cyber destruction thing as a particularly compelling way in which we can retaliate. Like, if the United States was to sort of try to fire a shot across the bows of Beijing, I don't think it would have a great deal of impact on the behavior of China itself, I suppose is what I'm trying to say. They have shown absolutely no compunction in just continuing to build the camps in Tianjin, to continue doing deals with regimes all over the world that most, as you said at the beginning of this segment, would consider unsavory types. They, from what I've read, as a general rule, the Chinese way of doing business is one that says prioritize making profit over any consideration, which perhaps is why they have less compunction doing deals with despots. And so I completely take your point, but I think that was just a long way round for me to say I literally have racked my brains and cannot see how we pressure them into changing their behavior.
I think it's an interesting global sort of chess play, if you will. Be a complete bastard. Once you have what you want, then give up something that you're prepared to give away. Yeah. I see this in the Putin play of right now he's massed troops on the border of the Ukraine, and everybody's getting nervous about that. I feel like he will trade the Ukraine as a response to an American cyber attack that turns the lights off in major Russian cities.
Interesting.
So he won't respond directly back to the United States.
No,
he already won the first round, which was, hey, I'm going to compromise your government. And, and if you provoke me, I'll do something that I know you can't respond with, because I know that we're not going to go to war over the Ukraine, despite, all the noises that are being made. And the fact that many European countries are dependent on Russian oil to get themselves through the next winter, right? And no government is going to risk putting their own citizens at starving to death in the cold.
Well, that's an interesting point. I mean, like the US just put pressure on Germany to stop constructing the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, right? So that's exactly what you're saying. That's the retaliation in kind from the US side. I don't know quite how Germany goes about, as you say, keeping its citizens warm if they do turn off the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. So, I mean, it seems that China, Russia, and their various satellites hold most of the cards at this point. But it's very hard to believe that to be the case, quite simply because actually we do know that the political environment for Putin in Russia is precarious. Whilst he maintains the support of the majority of the people, Navalny's imprisonment was perhaps a misstep. He's getting a lot of flack for that. The economy is extremely weak. It is not a robust country, with debt, with unrivaled resources, monetary resources, that is. China, on the other hand, really does seem to be able to do almost what it wants at this stage. There is very little moral imposition that we can put on it to make it change course, and I do think that engaging in talks is probably the only way to try and get it to shift its feet in the right way.
Well, on that note, and with thoughts about a more prosperous and more stable place as we emerge from the pandemic, thank you today. I think it was a really interesting discussion, and these are not easy problems to solve that our world leaders need to engage upon, because at the end of the day, it's not really the government that suffers, it's the people that have that government. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next month.
Thanks, Ian.